This video is sponsored by Squarespace. If you recently picked up a Fujifilm camera or you got one for Christmas, this video will help you get up and running with it by sharing 10 tips that I've learned over 7 years of using Fujifilm cameras to help you get the most out of your new purchase. Now, although each Fujifilm camera is slightly different, everything I'm sharing in this video will apply to pretty much all APS-C Fuji cameras. When you switch on the camera for the first time, you will notice that the screen will be peppered with various icons, and information overload is probably the best way I can describe it. Of course, some of it is essential. You want to see what ISO you're in, for example, or you want to see what focus mode you might be using. However, most of it, at least in my experience, is irrelevant for day-to-day shooting. So the first thing I would suggest you do is go into the display settings and turn off a bunch of these things. I need to read this because I don't remember it off by heart. So the first thing you want to do is go into display custom settings under the screen of display menu, and these are the things you want to leave on and everything else you want to switch off. So framing guideline, focus frame, MF distance indicator, histogram, shooting mode, aperture shutter speed ISO, information background, exposure compensation digital, white balance, frames remaining, digital teleconverter, mic level, no memory card warning, and battery level. In my opinion, at least in my experience, these are the items that I've always needed to know and see, and where they live around the screen, it actually looks very clean and tidy. It doesn't look like it's getting in your way, and it leaves less distractions when it comes to shooting and your composition. By default, the camera will emit a few different lights and make all sorts of sounds. I suggest turning all of that off. There is no real reason why you want your camera to beep when you focus or make other random electronic shutter noises. Unless you're into all of that, turn it off, because at best it's distracting. And also, if you're shooting somewhere quiet or you're trying to be more inconspicuous when you're traveling, that stuff can just draw attention to you. The only item which some people might argue is useful is that bright red focusing light. But that's only really useful if you're shooting in super dark places and you need to focus on something that's quite close to you, like an event with low light. But if you're shooting just generally at nighttime, it's not really gonna do much apart from draw attention to yourself. So switch all that off. Same goes for tally lights and all that kind of stuff, and you'll have a much more pleasant experience. Depending on the camera that you have, you might find loads of customizable buttons or just a handful. Either way, I highly suggest going into the menu and seeing if those features are something that would work for you. So for example, some default features would include changing the film simulation or white balance or anything else. You might not need to use that if you only shoot in RAW, for instance. So I suggest initially setting it up how you feel you would use the camera, but then changing it as you find you're not using that feature, or maybe you're missing something else. It might take you a little while. It took me a year of using a camera to properly dial it in, and even now sometimes I might change a few bits and bobs. By utilizing the custom buttons, if you do it properly for your particular style of shooting, you will remove any need to go into menus and waste time, and you will memorize them, and ultimately that will help you get the photos you want. The only one button I would highly suggest you customize and almost insist is the Recall Custom 1 feature, which I'll talk about later in this video. The same can apply to the quick function menu, and you can change how many squares you have in there as well. Now, some people use that menu to set all your JPEG simulation profiles, so you can quickly change your clarity or grain or other aspects of a JPEG simulation on the go. Personally, I just have it down to 4 squares and leave it for anything I've not managed to put on a custom button. Now, if you want to know how I set up a Fujifilm camera and go into much more detail, I have a bunch of guides covering the XT3, 4, 5, XH, X100, and there will be an X100VI guide either already out or out by the end of the year or in January, so watch out for that. I go into much more detail and I talk about exactly how I set things up, why I do it, and give you more practical examples. One of my favorite features of modern Fuji cameras is the ability to recall custom one settings. So on the bigger XH bodies, it literally means the number 1 on the dial, whilst on XT bodies, it means the digital version of that. You can effectively set up a particular camera configuration and then recall it by pressing the recall C1 function. To do that, you want to set up custom C1 and C2. C2 will be the mode you use all the time, and C1 is what you'd want to switch into now and again. On the bigger XH2 Fuji bodies, you can even have C1 as a video mode, so you can take some photos, quickly press C1, recall, and go into video. On the XT bodies or the X100 bodies, you can set that to a different exposure mode. So maybe normally you're shooting zone with multimetering. You can then press C1, recall, and that will get you into a spot metering and single point autofocus mode for more precise exposure and focusing. How you set them up is entirely up to you, but that is such a powerful feature that I genuinely think you'll be missing out on a chunk of usability of this camera by not utilizing it. Fuji cameras have a bunch of different focus modes and configurations. I only tend to use 2. The first one is AFS, which is autofocus single, and using a single point autofocus. So AFS is basically you've half pressed the shutter, it's focused and it's locked. You can recompose and the camera won't change the focusing at all. And the single point literally focuses on that one tiny square, and it's a very accurate and a good way to focus if you're shooting a lot of still life. And if your photography is very slow paced, landscapes, architecture, that kind of stuff. The other method I use is using the zone focus. And I don't mean zone focusing technique, but I mean the zone focus feature, which is a bigger square, let's just say, with a bunch of smaller squares inside it. And then I will use continuous autofocus. This is where I'm giving the camera more control over what exactly to focus. Now, it might not be as accurate as the previous one, but it'll get focused much quicker, especially if there's a lot of moving subjects. So if I'm moving or my subject is moving, that is the method I would use, because the camera will then track any changes in distance. When shooting in any automatic or semi-automatic mode, such as aperture priority, you need to tell the camera how you want it to expose the scene. Obviously, you have your exposure compensation, which tells the camera to increase or decrease the global exposure. But how do you want it to interpret what's in front of it? There are 3 main options here. The first one is called multi-metering mode. And effectively, the camera looks at the whole scene and makes a calculated decision based on the sky, the shadow, the highlights, all that kind of stuff, and combines them into one uniform exposure. And that should give you a roughly good starting point. And in most cases, it's actually enough. However, what if you're shooting out of a window and the camera is trying to expose for the window frame, but then what's in front of you, what's out the window, is blown out? This is where you want to use center weighted metering mode, and effectively the camera only exposes for what's right in the middle of the frame and discards what's around the edges. This is a great method for, as I've just said, shooting out of windows, shooting through something, or anytime you don't want it to pay attention to what's on the edges of the frame. And the final method is spot metering, and effectively it's one little spot, and wherever that spot lands, that's what the camera will meter for. Because Fuji cameras at this moment in time don't have highlight metering mode, this is what I use for highlight metering whenever I want to get that harsh, contrasty highlight and shadow look. I'd like to take a moment and thank Squarespace for sponsoring this video. It's never been easier to start your own business, blog or YouTube channel and turn your hobby into an income. Squarespace offers the perfect all-in-one solution that is designed to take the headache and hassle out of the entire process. First and foremost, this is your website where you can showcase your product or service in a clean and professional way. Secondly, this is your online store where you can sell your products and services with powerful tools built in. Thirdly, this is your blog where you can write about your industry, therefore increase Google ranking. And there are many other built-in tools that allow you to create members areas, send newsletters, schedule appointments, and much more. Finally, this is all available on your laptop or in your pocket. Add powerful analytics and you have an ideal all-in-one package to run your business. For a free trial followed by 10% off your first purchase, please use the link in the description or use code RomanFox when you check out. Thank you to Squarespace for sponsoring and thank you for watching. When you're shooting in auto or semi-auto like aperture priority, you also need to set auto ISO. Have you ever been shooting in, let's say, aperture priority or even in full auto, and when the light gets worse, your photos are still blurry and you're not sure why they're blurry because the camera shouldn't do everything itself? Well, the reason they're blurry is because the camera is forcing the shutter speed down in order to protect the ISO and remove the noise from the image. And because the camera doesn't know that you're hand holding it whilst shivering and trying to drink a beer at the same time, it obviously doesn't know that you need a higher shutter speed. So the first thing I'll do is go into the auto ISO settings and I will change the minimum shutter speed to something of 1/200. But this really depends on where you shoot and how you shoot. I will then adjust the ISO parameters and I will set the max at 6400 and the minimum at base or whatever the lowest number is. Save that as your auto ISO 1. Auto ISO 2, you can make a more kind of night photography friendly setup where you'll have a slightly lower shutter speed of maybe 1/100, but you'll have a higher base ISO of 500 or 1000. And then you can make a high shutter speed auto ISO 3 setting where, for example, you want to prioritize the shutter speed. So you'll have your minimum ISO at 1000, but also your minimum shutter speed at 500. That way, every time you take a photo, the camera will not use an ISO value lower than 1000, which will give you a bit more noise if you're pixel peeping, but you know that shutter speed is staying high as well. How you combine them and how you set them up depends entirely on what you shoot, what focal length you use and all that kind of stuff. But definitely set this up, at the very least, how I first mentioned it, to avoid blurry photos at night. Fuji cameras have 3 methods of locking exposure and focus. This, in my opinion, is a trick to get so much more out of your camera. So let's start with AEL. AEL is auto exposure lock. So you expose on the scene, you press AEL, and if you set it up as a toggle rather than just a button, once you've pressed it, the camera stays locked with that exposure. So you can expose for the highlights, for instance, and then you can recompose, move things around without the exposure being impacted. You could do the same with focusing. You can focus on something, let's say you're an AFC, which is continuous, but then you can lock it by using AFL that you would set up in the custom buttons, and the focusing system is locked. The best one, in my opinion, is a combination of the two called literally AEL and AFL. You assign it to one button, and when you've pushed that button, the focus and the exposure are locked. So what it means is you can have your scene, you can expose, you can focus, you can lock it, and then you can move around, change composition, use foreground elements, or just wait for people to go past without any of that interfering with the focusing or the exposure. Fuji is known for JPEG photos, however, don't dismiss the RAWs. The RAW files have a lot of room for editing, plus a lot of that Fuji feel, the colors, the contrast are baked into the RAW file. If you compare a RAW file from a Fuji to a Sony, for example, the Fuji file will not need that much editing to make it look good, whereas something like a Sony file would need a lot more work to get there. Also in Lightroom and Capture One, maybe some other apps I don't know, you can actually use these simulations as profiles, although they'll never be exactly how Fuji intended them to because they're simply guesses by those companies. It gives you a good starting point for editing. Fuji even has its own software, which I forgot, but you can get it from their website, that lets you apply the JPEG profile onto the RAW file retrospectively. If I remember rightly, it was a bit of a longer process, but it's something that is possible. Even though these JPEG profiles are amazing, I would highly suggest you set the camera up for JPEG plus RAW, because you would never know when that RAW file can turn a badly exposed photo into a really good photo. And finally, it's JPEG profiles. This is what these cameras are known for, and this is one of the biggest reasons why people buy them, because they don't want to edit, they just want to have something that looks really nice straight out of camera. I've published 2 blogs on JPEG profiles that I've linked them below. One in particular is my favorite summer profile. It's very warm and very vibrant. And the other blog is a few different profiles for you to try, experiment with, and see how it goes. There are other websites. I believe Fuji X Weekly does a bunch of profiles which are based around actual film simulations and film stock. Mine are not. They're just, messing around until something looks good. Either way, check it out, play around with that, and that's it. So I hope you found this video helpful. If you have, give it a like. If you have any questions, please leave them down below. If you want to find out a lot more about gear, whether it's Fujifilm, Sony, or any other brands, my website is where 99% of gear stuff lives. If you go on my website, go on the blog, and then just select gear, as you're going down, you will find a bunch of stuff. Failing that, you can always Google, let's say, snaps by Fox, and let's just say Fujifilm focusing, or whatever you want, and that blog will pop up. Right, that's all from me. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye for now.